Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or welcome for the first time. I wanted to thank everyone who had a chance to subscribe, and if you haven't, feel free to hit me up on my channel. Also my Instagram, which is here, at Tay Barrand. I have the link in my bio as well. In this second video, I am going to discuss and kind of talk about and tell my story of the last year. A year ago, on January 24th, I was admitted into Skyland Trail in Atlanta, Georgia, which is a mental health residential treatment facility. There are a lot of things that added up to that being my kind of last resort in a way. I tried pretty much everything. So since my sophomore year of college, my mental health and mental well-being took a significant decline. I became significantly more depressed. My self-harm doubled, almost tripled, and then at the time in January, about a year ago, that entire fall, it was almost a daily struggle or action. That winter semester of school was the first time I ever got a C in my life. I was sleeping through class because I couldn't get out of bed, and I wasn't complying with my medication. I just wasn't happy. I hadn't felt like myself in so long that I didn't even know who I was or what myself meant. And so after doing over the years multiple different partial hospitalization programs, intensive outpatient, and even an inpatient stay, my parents, on the way down to Florida for family vacation for winter break, they came to me and said, "Taylor, we think it's time that we look into a different answer. We don't want you to go back to school in the spring. We want you to look into going to residential." I was shocked, except at the same time I wasn't. I was a little bit relieved that I'm not gonna have to live my entire life like this, hopefully. But my biggest fear when I started crying was I had a cat at the time, Lucy, and she was my everything. And I was crying to my mom, and I was like, "I can't leave Lucy for longer than 10 days. What am I gonna do?" And they both laughed, and they were like, "That's exactly what we said." So it took a very long time to figure out where I wanted to go and a lot of research. And fortunately enough, at Skyland Trail, I was able to actually have my cat, Lucy, live with me, which honestly in the end was an absolute game changer. I'll do another video specifically on all of my experience within residential, because honestly that could be 2 videos. It was a lot. So I'm just gonna kind of skip forward. So when I first got there, I was super defiant. I was like, I'm gonna do things my way. I don't want to give up self-harm. I don't believe that I can get better. Basically, good luck. Try me. That obviously did not work out very well. And it took probably almost a month, a couple weeks, for me to realize that, wait, what's happening? Why am I even here? And a friend of mine that was in residential with me looked at me and said, "Well, your way of doing things is what got you here." And I was like, whoa. I don't know why I hadn't considered that. I know it sounds so simple, but it was I do have to relinquish control. I do have to give them the ability to give me guidance and listen to them and do the things they're telling me if I ever want to get better. So fast forward, after residential, they told me that I couldn't move into the transitional apartments that most of the mental health residential patients would move into, because I needed more supervision because I was still struggling with self-harm. And so I actually moved into sober living. And again, that's another video for another day. It's a long thing. But the first sober living I was in, it was very big. And it was only 3 days of being out and happy and excited for then the temptation of self-harm urges to just take over. And it was kind of almost like I was snapped so quickly back into reality of what's possible and what I can do, and meaning I'm not being supervised every time I go to a store, or I'm not getting checked on every hour, whatnot. I have the freedom to go to the grocery store by myself, do what I need to do, and I abused that freedom. And I ended up self-harming three times within 2 weeks. Part of my treatment agreement with the clinical staff at Skyland was I had to abide by their rules or medical opinions. So I had to get stitches 2 of those times. And that's when the directors of the sober living I was at came in and said, hey, pack up your stuff, you're going back into residential. I was devastated. I was frustrated. I was upset with myself because how had I worked so hard for 10 weeks in residential to then get out 3 days later, self-harm, and then not even a week later, and then the week after that, end up in the ER. It was a huge wake-up call. I ended up being in residential again. I ended up being there for 10 days. I really realized that in order to move forward, I was gonna have to give up self-harm. I actually had to sign a contract in order to come back saying that if I self-harmed, I would get kicked out of sober living. So I had a lot riding on this. A lot. So I did pretty well after that and got through Skyland. Ended up doing an extra month of day patient, outpatient, whatever you want to call it. And then finally I graduated, and it was such a surreal feeling to be done. But I didn't have enough to do at the time. Summer school was already started. I couldn't take classes. I was trying to get a job and at the same time didn't want to overwhelm myself. At the time when I had first gotten to sober living, and then especially at this time, I started doing yoga again. When I was really depressed, I hated working out, and it had kind of been ruined for me when I quit swimming after I swam my freshman year of college. Not to mention, I hated myself. I hated how I looked, and I didn't believe that any amount of effort I put in was going to change that. So when I was in sober living, I got into yoga, and honestly, that even in itself is almost on the same level playing field as treatment was in terms of just how significant of a difference it's made in my life. So I was basically just doing yoga, had way too much free time on my hands, way too much. And that's when all of the urges kicked back in. And also at the same time, this was when Instagram first started taking down photos for promoting self-injurious or suicidal ideation. I had, just in 2 days alone, I think I had 7 photos taken down. Since then, it's probably been upwards of, I actually don't even know, because I've posted things so many times trying to get them to stay, but it's a story for another day. So something I'd always struggled with was when I had too much free time, or got very bored, and when I was in a bad place, that's when the urges and the negative thoughts and those negative voices came back saying hey, remember this? Hey, remember that? You want to do this, don't you? And when you have too much time on your hands and that's all you can think of, the urges begin to take over. And that's definitely the piece of my self-harm that's 100% the addiction aspect. And so unfortunately, I convinced myself one night that they weren't actually going to kick me out if I self-harmed. I chose to self-harm, wasn't going to tell anyone, was just going to let it go. And then the next day I decided, I was like, all right, they're not actually going to kick me out. I'm going to tell them. And so here begins honestly one of the most trying periods since I'd gotten, since before residential, in the last 2 years. I mean, it was hard. So I went to the ER to get stitches. It was noon on a Monday. I walked in myself. The self-harm was not in an area that would be perceived as life-threatening or anything, and so I really thought it was going to be like the other times I'd gotten stitches where I'd walk in, They'd ask me a bunch of questions, they'd do the work, I'd get cleared, and I would leave and get to go back home. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Next thing I knew, the nurse was coming in saying, I need you to give me all of your clothes and your belongings. And I was like, what? I begged her to call my sober living director, thinking she would say like, hey, this is just a part of her like mental illness, it's a symptom, it's part of borderline personality disorder, it's not uncommon for self-injurious behaviors to not be life-threatening or like with a suicidal intent behind them. But instead, the doctor came back in and said, your sober living director said you have nowhere to go because you're no longer back welcome there. I felt like my entire world was just ending. They took my phone. I couldn't call anyone. I couldn't call the people I knew that I was close to. I couldn't call my mom. I couldn't call my dad. I begged them to let me use the phone. They said no. I had 2 cops security, sitting in the room with me. Thank God one of the nurses let me keep like this fidget toy thing I had, because otherwise I really honestly think I would have like lost it. It was very nice of her. So they tell me the next step is I'm going to this inpatient facility to get assessed by a psychiatrist because their ER doesn't have one on staff. So finally they let me call my mom. Very emotional. Thankfully she is as wonderful as she is, and immediately found a flight and flew down as soon as she could. I had to be transported in an ambulance, which was miserable. I get there and I'm sitting there thinking, all right, let's get this over with. I'm gonna meet with the assessment people, then I'm gonna meet with the psychiatrist, explain everything, and they'll understand. The admissions guy comes in and starts talking to me, and I said, well, when can I see the psychiatrist? And he looked at me, looked down at the paper, looked back up at me, and he said, has no one told you what's going on? I was like, what do you mean? They told me I'm here for an assessment. He said, no, you've been legally 1013'd. I was like, I have no idea what that means. Basically that legally I am being held involuntarily for a minimum of 72 hours. Minimum. I was scared. I was angry. I felt like no one in that emergency room had told me what was going on or why or whatever. Like it was awful. But ultimately, I really screwed up. I had all the answers. I just wasn't using them. I could have contacted my sober living advisor and said, hey, can you come here? Like, I need help. I could have called a friend. I could have done a numerous amount of things, and I made the decision not to. Thankfully, my mom is who she is and worked with my new therapist outside of the inpatient place to quickly find another sober living so that when I got out, I could go to that sober living. I moved in. Unfortunately, this was not one that I was even remotely comfortable in. There weren't any other residents like there were in the last sober living that were kind of more in the same place as me, where they were there for specifically mental health, not drug or alcohol addiction. So very quickly, I started to try to find somewhere else to live. And at this time, I was really struggling because I was so unhappy with self-harm urges. However, at this time, I was really motivated because I didn't ever want to go back into an inpatient facility like that, or anyone in general. It was, God, it was so bad. So I finally find another sober living like about 2.5, 3 weeks later. And instead of having 24 girls or whatever, this one only had room for 6. And so I moved in, and this was the sober living I stayed in from end of June something through October 5th. In order to get out of inpatient, I had to agree to basically do treatment again, another type of treatment. So that's when I got admitted or started an intensive outpatient program that was Monday, Wednesday, Fridays at a place called the Berman Center. In Skyland, I was on the dialectical behavioral track period, which is very different than the why can't I remember what it's called? Cognitive based therapy. There it is. You're welcome. And so in Skyland, yeah, there were process groups, but not the same. And so at um, Berman, I had process groups every morning and like other times, and I was able to work through a lot of the things that actually I hadn't touched on or worked through, such as uh, abusive relationships, sexually related trauma, things like that I didn't get to address there, and I got to address at Berman. Um, I ended up being able to work towards being just a happier version of myself. Way I wouldn't have cared about anything in those times in my life where I was in a dark place. I knew I had to get up and feed her. I had to get up and do her litter. I had to play with her. She would come in my room when I was upset. She would come in my room when I wasn't upset. Um, I saved her life when she was a baby, but she saved my life on so many occasions. She was incredible. Um, but that was just as soon as things were kind of going really well. And I felt like I got hit by a bus. I was like, what did I do to deserve this? I've been working so hard. I've put in all the work. I've done all the effort. I got really angry at the world. And I was like, you already gave me diagnoses that are some of the most stigmatized. You already inserted people into my life that were horrible. You already, I don't know, made me the way I was. And I was angry and I was blaming the world and like thinking like, no, all these things happened because so and so was against me, or no one wanted me to succeed, or whatever. And now, arguably, one of the best things to ever happen to me in my life was just going to be gone. I still miss her. She'll forever be the world to me, and I'm very grateful and thankful that my parents were able to keep her alive in order for me to fly home and see her. Um, so that was really hard. I already knew that I was moving out October 5th, and I found an apartment downtown closer to school. Um, oh, yeah, in August I started school. My bad. But I still was doing Berman, but I wasn't taking a very heavy course load, so okay there. But sorry, anywho. So once I was back in school and living on my own, again, I was still doing pretty well. I mean, the initial like excitement of, oh my gosh, I'm on my own in my own apartment. I can go do things without a curfew. I could go wherever I want, whenever I want. I could go grocery shopping at 1 a.m. if I want to. I don't, but I could. I could have people come over, because these were all things in sober living that I didn't have. I hadn't had since April. I mean, arguably since January. And it was amazing. And I got a little bit ahead of myself. I didn't really realize how difficult school was going to be coming back after taking such a long time off. I've always really enjoyed school and thought it was something I'm pretty good at, but going back with that expectation was far too high of an expectation for myself. So I began getting really frustrated. Thankfully, I still had yoga and I was still working really hard at that. Like I said, I had the kittens. It was amazing. I had a couple friends who were just, and still are, so supportive and so incredible. But I slowly started to feel myself that like little things that would happen, like arguments in certain situations, or honestly just my negative self-talk, like, you're stupid, you're gonna fail, you're never gonna graduate, you're a fifth year in a class of all freshmen. I really struggled with body image issues because I had lost a significant amount of weight since being depressed. And where I was at before, I was actually very unhealthy, and I was so unhappy, like I needed to adjust it. But now I felt like no matter what I adjusted, it wasn't enough. No matter how much I studied, it wasn't enough. No matter how hard I worked in therapy, maybe it was enough, until it wasn't. Not giving into self-harm urges wasn't enough anymore. And I think this is where the addiction piece comes in, like, very strongly. And I'll make another video specifically about self-harm if anyone's interested, but I slowly began convincing myself that you're doing everything else right, everything else except for like school. Meaning I'm doing my laundry, I'm doing dishes, I'm showering, I'm sleeping, I'm being social, whatnot. And I abused the fact that I was on my own. I didn't want to be honest with my new therapist, who's incredible. She's amazing. She has totally changed my life. But I didn't want to be honest because I don't know if ashamed's the wrong word, but I was disappointed in myself. But then all that did was start a spiral. And it took me a decent chunk of time to realize, like, it's almost been a year since I went to treatment. Is this the direction I want my life to take again? Do I want to be back in a residential program 2, 1 year, 4 years down the line, trying to stop my self-harm urges that I have pretty much all the answers of how to stop them, theoretically. They don't always work for everyone, but I know what I'm supposed to do. I just wasn't doing it. And I think that's probably, arguably, over this last year, one of the biggest pieces I learned is there's a difference between willingness and willfulness. Willingness is like, yeah, all right, I'll try it. Okay, I'm willing. Willfulness is saying no way. I'm going to do it my way. That's not right. Or there's no way that's going to work. Or I'm unwilling to try. And I guess I hadn't realized for so long how much, like, being willful had such a significant impact in how horrible my mental health became. And don't get me wrong, I still have struggles. I still have a lot of negative self-talk. I still have plenty of urges. I mean, I still in the recent times have had self-harm relapses. But the difference is that doesn't control my life anymore. I have times where I'm happy and excited and can go do things and I'm being social. I have times where I can see, like, hey, I'm going to graduate, it's going to be okay. Maybe the next day I'm like, no, it's never going to happen. But I can look back on that other day and say, all right, well, I thought at one time I can do it again. The longest I had been free of self-harm since starting in Skyland was 72 days. And that was from transitioning, like, kind of end of residential into sober living at first. And then the second time was 64 days, I believe. And that, I mean, I hadn't been making it more than one day in the last year, like, before that. And mostly, I mean, I hadn't made it that far since my freshman year of college. I can't say that I've made it to either one of those numbers yet, but I've kind of changed my perspective and not really seen it as, like, I have to get to this number, I have to get to that day, because that just adds so much pressure. I'm going to take it day by day. I'm going to get through this day. It adds a lot of pressure to expect myself to use all of the skills, to not self-harm, to reach out for help, to be happy because I should be. I get so far ahead of myself in that I'm going to fail, that I'm not good enough, that I've put in some work, but it's not enough. I'm not a good person. I mean, these are all things I tell myself every day. And I mean, I know saying them out loud in a video, it's like, wow, why do I say those things? But it's like an automatic thought. So what I really tried to focus on is taking it day by day. I'm not great at it. It's still taking a lot of practice, but I look back on all all of the hard work I've done, and like even in the little things that I've changed that like seemed so insignificant but have actually become more significant than anything, such as like thinking before I talk or taking a break when I need to, recognizing when I'm being emotional, any of those things. But taking it day by day, I'm filled with gratitude for where I've come and what I've done. And I still have a long ways to go. I still want to work on myself. I still need to fight my self-harm addiction. I still, every single day, have borderline personality disorder, and it's not going away. It's a personality disorder. It's how I am. There's some things that, as many times as I try a skill, automatically, I'm still going to be a certain way. But it's how I deal with it now or after or right after. And I think that really goes for a lot of things that I've learned is before it was always, I did this wrong, I'm a failure, or that went horrible, this is never going to go well. It was all what happened. But now when something happens, I try to look at, okay, well, but what's next? What's the next best thing I can do for myself, for someone else, for a situation? And ultimately, I think that's really made it so that I'm happy. Like I said, I still have my struggles, but for the most part, I wake up in the morning with 2 kittens in my bed, texts from my friends, Snapchats, whatever, and just think like, damn, this isn't too bad. So yeah, that was totally choppy and all over the place, but my plan next is to do a video on my diagnoses, and then I'm gonna do a couple other videos like on the different treatment places I've been and done. But for the most part, I mean, there's kind of a very messy, mixed up year in review for me. But hey, if you haven't, feel free to subscribe to the channel. I'm only gonna try to work harder at like making the videos more viewer friendly, I guess. I am super excited to share this with y'all. So yeah, I mean, whoever you are, whatever you're doing, try to look at your day and be as grateful as possible. Be willing to try something new. And remember, no matter what, you're an amazing person. And I know that sounds so cheesy, but it is. You're the only you that exists. So when you're having a bad day, remind yourself of that. All right. Thanks, y'all.